If you're tired of living the same poor life, here's the truth nobody warned you about: your old self is already dead. And the reason everything around you feels stale, heavy, or painfully too small is because you've been trying to resurrect an identity that no longer exists. You're not stuck because you're weak, you're stuck because your system is trying to run a future self frequency inside an expired version of you. That tension you feel every morning? That quiet anger at your own routine? That's a frequency incompatibility event, not failure. Most people will tell you to push harder, hustle more, fix your mindset. But your future self wants to tell you something radically different. You don't need more effort. You need a death. Not a physical death, an identity death. A quantum death. The kind where the version of you that kept your life small finally collapses under the weight of who you're meant to become. Your old life has already ended, yes, just like that, without ceremony, without warning, without asking for your permission. And the strange thing is, you didn't stumble into this message by accident. You're here because the old life, the dead life, has already collapsed under a frequency incompatibility event, and the version of you that once operated on autopilot isn't energetically viable anymore. Think of it like turning the dial on a radio station. You've drifted out of range, and the static you've been feeling is proof that the signal changed before you consciously noticed. To a transition guardian observing your field, the collapse is obvious. To you, it shows up as confusion, burnout, or the eerie sensation of living inside a phantom life. Most people think these crises mean failure, weakness, or a personal malfunction. But if you look closer, through the lens of quantum biology and identity metamorphosis, what you're experiencing is a documented principle: identities function as frequencies, not stories. When a frequency no longer matches its container, it dissolves. Spiritual death, quantum death, identity phase transitions, they all describe the same phenomenon: the moment the caterpillar self stops resonating with its old reality. The grief of old self emerging in you isn't a mistake, it's a biological sign that the system is shedding the ghosts of dead lives. This is why relationships break without reason, routines collapse, motivations evaporate, and old triggers suddenly lose their power. These aren't coincidences, they're indicators that the old operating system has shut down. When people say they don't recognize themselves anymore, what they really mean is, the coherence field of the previous identity has already decohered. You're standing inside the gap between versions, and the nervous system is trying to catch up to a quantum leap the psyche already made. Strange mourning shows up because something has died, something real, but it wasn't you. It was the structure that used to define you. And here's the part most never hear: reaching this point means you're not collapsing, you're upgrading. You're witnessing the identity breakdown that precedes metamorphosis, the same way a chrysalis looks like a disaster before it becomes a butterfly. The quantum soup phase begins long before you realize you've entered it. The void tolerance practice begins the moment your old narratives fail to reboot. You being here, reading this, is evidence that your system is searching for a quantum death navigation protocol because the old framework is beyond resuscitation. So don't rush to fix anything. Don't try to resurrect routines that no longer hold resonance. Just recognize this truth: the transition has already begun. And if you pay close attention, you'll notice that something else, quiet, subtle, insistent, is already forming in the fertile darkness behind the scenes. Something will unfold in the next stage. Quantum death isn't metaphorical, it's biological, neurological, and vibrational all at once. It happens when an identity no longer has the energetic coherence required to sustain itself in the system. In quantum biology, we call this a frequency collapse, the moment when the resonance pattern that once held your old life together, your habits, your preferences, even your personality, can no longer maintain structural integrity. It's not that you chose to change, it's that the pattern maintaining the old life reached its expiration point. This is spiritual death understood through the lens of physics instead of mysticism, the moment your caterpillar self can't function inside its outdated container. Identities aren't stories, they're frequencies. The narrative you tell about yourself is just the translation of an underlying resonance signal. When that frequency shifts, the story dissolves. This is why identity metamorphosis feels disorienting. You try to recall who you were, and it feels blurry, like reaching for a phantom life. You attempt to revive old motivations, but they glitch, because the emotional resonance that once fueled them is gone. In quantum terms, this is decoherence, the old identity losing its capacity to synchronize with the rhythms of your current consciousness. The mismatch generates friction, burnout, emptiness, the sense that you're floating without reference points. When people say they feel disconnected from their old desires, old habits, even their old goals, they're describing the energetic mechanics of quantum death. Your previous self relies on a stable frequency environment to survive, and once that frequency becomes incompatible, the structure collapses. This frequency incompatibility event is not random, it's a response to accumulated inner pressure, suppressed potential, and the gravitational pull of the future self that's trying to emerge. The higher self doesn't negotiate, it upgrades. And the system follows, even if the conscious mind resists. That's why grief of old self often arrives alongside intuitive clarity. You're mourning the death of an outdated identity while simultaneously glimpsing the blueprint of the new one. Think of identity phase transitions the way physics describes matter. When water heats to a certain point, it doesn't decide to become vapor, it simply can't remain water anymore. Likewise, there comes a moment when your old life reaches its structural limit. The caterpillar doesn't choose transformation, its biology demands it. You're experiencing that same inevitability on a consciousness level. The chrysalis stage begins when the system recognizes that maintaining the old narrative requires more energy than dissolving it. That dissolution is the quantum soup phase, chaotic, fertile, and utterly necessary. This is why your old patterns feel distant or even impossible to perform. It's not laziness, it's loss of energetic viability. The blueprint that once organized your behavior is gone. And if you lean in gently, instead of fighting to restore the old coherence, you'll notice that a new resonance is forming, quiet, embryonic, unmistakable. It's the first impulse of the next identity, waiting to be decoded, and soon, the symptoms of this transition will become even more visible. The signs of quantum death rarely look mystical, they look inconvenient, destabilizing, and strangely anticlimactic. When the old identity collapses, the first fractures usually appear in relationships. Conversations stop flowing, connections feel misaligned, and people you once resonated with suddenly feel like echoes of a ghost you no longer are. This isn't personal conflict, it's frequency mismatch. Your old life was built around a resonance pattern that no longer exists, and the social structures dependent on that pattern lose coherence as well. You start experiencing the grief of old self not because you miss them, but because you sense their world disappearing around you. Then comes the collapse of routine. The habits that once held your dead life in place begin to disintegrate. You wake up and the familiar script of who you used to be simply doesn't load. Tasks that were effortless feel alien. Even basic motivation feels like trying to reboot software that no longer supports your operating system. In quantum biology terms, this is a coherence breakdown. The neural pathways associated with your old identity stop receiving resonance reinforcement, and the nervous system struggles to orient. What you interpret as exhaustion is often decoherence, the energetic infrastructure dissolving beneath your behavior. Emotional noise is another unmistakable marker. Not necessarily sadness, but static, irritability, emptiness, restlessness, a feeling of being underwater. This emotional turbulence is the system recalibrating after a frequency incompatibility event. Your inner landscape is shifting from the caterpillar self to the chrysalis stage, and the psyche hasn't caught up. Old triggers lose their potency, not because you healed them consciously, but because the identity that reacted to them is gone. This is the early stage of immunity to old triggers, a natural byproduct of identity phase transitions. And then there's the floating sensation, the eerie midpoint where you're not anchored in who you were but haven't yet stabilized into who you're becoming. Many people mistake this for depression or burnout, but it's far more precise, it's the quantum soup state beginning to form. You're dissolving, but you haven't reorganized. The mind tries to grasp familiar narratives to regain control, but the body knows the truth, returning to the phantom life isn't an option. The future self is pulling your frequency forward, even while the conscious mind clings to old reference points. These symptoms aren't glitches, they're diagnostics. They tell you the non-resuscitation process has already begun. The system is dismantling the scaffolding of the old identity, and you're witnessing the breakdown in real time. And if you listen closely, beneath the noise, beneath the confusion, there's a subtle impulse guiding you toward the next stage. That impulse becomes impossible to ignore once you cross into the void, where all identities dissolve and reorganize. The void isn't a metaphor. It's the actual energetic gap between identities, the liminal space where your old coherence field has dissolved but the new frequency hasn't stabilized yet. When people say they feel like they're in between lives, this is the precise phenomenon. You're standing inside the quantum soup, that fertile darkness where nothing holds shape because everything is being reorganized on a level deeper than thought. This is the territory where spiritual death becomes visible, where the ghosts of dead lives hover around you, not to haunt, but to signal that their cycle is complete. Most fear the void because the nervous system interprets loss of identity as danger. The brain is wired to choose a familiar suffering over an unknown freedom. It will try to drag you back into the phantom life simply because it knows how to survive there. But the void isn't a threat. It's a chrysalis, dark, dense, and shockingly intelligent. Just like the caterpillar dissolves into a molecular soup before reorganizing into a butterfly, your psyche is undergoing a similar dissolution. The chaos you feel is not collapse, it's recalibration. Nothing is wrong. Everything is being rewritten. The reason the void feels endless is because your orientation system, your memories, habits, emotional anchors, has gone offline. You're not supposed to know who you are in the void. That's the whole point. The identity metamorphosis happening here cannot be rushed, named, or forced into clarity. The fertile darkness rearranges you without negotiation. And if you try to cling to the old identity, you'll feel it instantly as friction, fatigue, or emotional static. That's the nervous system signaling a frequency incompatibility event. The old self cannot survive this altitude. Void tolerance becomes essential here. This isn't about being still, it's about not collapsing backward. Your only task is to remain present without resurrecting the old life. This is where many break the non-resuscitation pact without realizing it, reaching for old patterns, old relationships, old fears just to feel something. But the void isn't asking you to feel something, it's asking you to feel nothing long enough for the reorganization to complete. The quiet you're encountering is not emptiness, it's the sound of identity phase transitions happening in real time. And if you listen closely, beneath the confusion and the strange mourning, there's a pulse, soft, almost imperceptible. It's the first heartbeat of the new frequency. The higher self uses the void like wet clay, shaping the contours of the future self before you're conscious of it. The void isn't the end, it's the preface. And once you understand how this chrysalis works, you'll begin to see why what happens next is not only inevitable, but sacred in its precision. The chrysalis stage isn't symbolic, it's literal. In nature, the caterpillar doesn't transform into a butterfly, it dissolves into a biochemical soup. Enzymes break down its body into undifferentiated cells, and from that fertile chaos, a new organism reorganizes itself. This isn't a gentle process, it's a complete dismantling. And the same thing happens inside you during identity metamorphosis. What feels like nothing happening is actually everything happening. Your psychic structures are melting, your emotional wiring is loosening, and your energetic field is preparing for a quantum leap into a version of yourself that your old identity couldn't sustain. Quantum biology calls this the imaginal cell activation, tiny clusters of future potential that were dormant in the caterpillar, suddenly awakening and taking over the system. This is identical to what you experience when flashes of your future self appear out of nowhere. You catch glimpses of new preferences, new desires, new instincts that don't belong to your old life. These are imaginal impulses rising from your higher self. And the friction you feel, the confusion, the grief of old self, the floating sensation, comes from the battle between the dissolving identity and the emerging one. The chrysalis is not comfortable by design, it is transformational pressure calibrated with precision. The quantum soup phase inside the chrysalis is the same void you're navigating now, a place where the old coherence has collapsed, and a new frequency is assembling itself cell by cell, thought by thought, impulse by impulse. Identity phase transitions always follow this pattern. At first, nothing seems to make sense. Old motivations vanish. Former dreams feel like ghosts of dead lives. And in their place, a silent intelligence begins to reformat your internal architecture. You're not lost, you're being recompiled. The danger here is premature emergence. In nature, if you break the chrysalis too early, the butterfly dies because its wings haven't hardened, its frequency hasn't stabilized. Humans do the same thing, they try to exit their transformation before they've achieved immunity to old triggers. They rush into relationships, jobs, decisions, environments that belong to the dead life, hoping to feel grounded. But grounding won't come from the past. It can only come from the new frequency assembling within you. This is why the non-resuscitation pact is essential. The old identity cannot be allowed to reboot. And yet, within the chrysalis, there is something miraculous unfolding. The system is rewriting your resonance blueprint. Your future self is taking shape, quietly, intelligently, without your conscious permission. And soon, as the imaginal structure becomes strong enough, you'll begin to feel the first signs of reorganization. The pressure will shift. The darkness will thin. And the next stage, the point of no return, will come into view. There comes a moment in every transformation where you must make a quiet but irreversible agreement with yourself. You will not resurrect the old identity. This is the non-resuscitation pact, and it's one of the most critical components of the entire quantum death navigation protocol. When the old life collapses, it doesn't disappear cleanly, it lingers as a phantom life, whispering familiar scripts, offering the illusion of safety. These ghosts of dead lives try to pull you back into outdated patterns not because they're powerful, but because they're known. But what's known is no longer viable. A frequency incompatibility event has already occurred, and returning to the dead life would be like forcing a butterfly back into a caterpillar's skin. The brain, however, doesn't understand metamorphosis. It understands survival. And it will try, with surprising intensity, to drag you into environments, relationships, behaviors, and narratives that match the old coherence field. This is neural inertia, the mind attempting to re-establish predictability by rebooting the identity you've already outgrown. You might catch yourself craving old habits, revisiting old wounds, reaching for old emotional cycles, not because you need them, but because your nervous system is seeking orientation. This is where most people collapse backward, mistaking familiarity for belonging and mistaking nostalgia for truth. The non-resuscitation pact protects you from that collapse. It's a conscious refusal to re-enter frequency zones that no longer resonate with your emerging self. It's the moment you recognize that the grief of old self isn't an invitation to return, but a signal that the mourning process has begun. If you go back now, into the same conversations, the same people, the same emotional choreography, you're not healing, you're reattaching to a structure that's already dead. And once an identity reaches the point of quantum death, any attempt to revive it causes energetic friction, fatigue, anxiety spikes, emotional static, or that hollow sense of betrayal you feel in your chest. Think of it like the chrysalis. If the caterpillar attempted to cling to its former form during dissolution, the butterfly would never emerge. The same is true for you. Identity phase transitions require the system to release the old resonance completely. Immunity to old triggers only stabilizes when you stop feeding the old pathways with attention and emotion. The brain cannot unlearn what it keeps rehearsing. This is why the non-resuscitation pact acts like a transition guardian. It holds the border between who you were and who you're becoming, keeping the threshold clean. And beneath this commitment, something else unfolds. The new frequency begins to strengthen. When you stop trying to resurrect the old life, you create enough silence for the future self to speak. Its impulses become clearer. Its instincts sharpen. And the identity metamorphosis accelerates. Because the truth is, once you refuse to re-enter the dead life, the transformation stops being theoretical, it becomes inevitable. And from here forward, the next step is to clean the residue the old identity left behind. Once the non-resuscitation pact is made, the next phase is purification, clearing the residual data of the old identity so it no longer interferes with the emerging frequency. Think of this as an identity inventory, an intentional sorting of what belongs to the dead life and what can be carried forward into the metamorphosis. When a caterpillar dissolves in the chrysalis, not every cell becomes soup. Some cells, the imaginal ones, contain the blueprint for the butterfly. The same is true for you. Not everything from the old self is meant to die. Some elements are seeds for the future self, and your work is to discern the difference. Start with the obvious residues, beliefs that once defined you but now feel like wearing clothes from a phantom life, emotional loops that replay like echoes of someone you no longer are, scripts you inherited from family, culture, or trauma that no longer match your energetic intelligence. These residues are the ghosts of dead lives, patterns without resonance, identities without frequency. When you hold them in your field, they create interference, making the identity metamorphosis slower and more painful. Letting them go isn't abandonment, it's alignment. Then look at memories. Not all memories are meant to be kept as emotional truths. Some memories belong to the version of you that underwent quantum death and should be stored as archived data, not active identity. When you revisit a memory and feel that strange mourning, the grief of old self, that's the system telling you, this belongs to who you were, not who you are becoming. Moving it out of active circulation frees your coherence field to recalibrate. This is emotional decluttering at the quantum level, no attachment, no rejection, just recognition. But the identity inventory isn't only about releasing. It's also about retrieving what must be carried forward, skills you've developed, wisdom you've earned, intuitions that survived every collapse. These elements are imaginal structures, components of your higher self that remain intact through every identity phase transition. Pay attention to what still feels alive, resonant, instinctive. These are the frequencies that will help you navigate the quantum soup and stabilize the new self. They're not relics of the past, they're foundations of the future. Done properly, the identity inventory creates something rare, spaciousness. Suddenly, the noise drops. The confusion softens. You feel a subtle click inside your field, a quiet coherence returning, like the first formation of wings inside a chrysalis. This space is essential, because the next stage requires stability and stillness. You're about to enter the most delicate part of the metamorphosis, navigating the void without collapsing backward. The void is not a place you pass through, it's a place you learn to withstand. Navigating the quantum soup requires a kind of quiet strength most people never develop because they're too busy trying to escape it. In the void, the old identity has dissolved, but the new one hasn't formed yet. You're a resonance field without a story, and that absence of narrative feels terrifying to the nervous system. This is where most individuals accidentally re-enter the phantom life. Not out of desire, but out of discomfort. This is why void tolerance practice is essential. It trains you to stay present in the fertile darkness long enough for identity metamorphosis to stabilize. Void tolerance isn't about passivity, it's about micro-regulation. Small, intentional shifts that keep you from collapsing backward into the dead life. One of the most powerful tools is slow breathing, which recalibrates the vagus nerve and reduces the survival instinct triggered by identity dissolution. Another is micro-intention, tiny, non-demanding cues sent to your field. I'm available for the new frequency, I release what no longer resonates, I trust the transition. These micro-signals anchor you without forcing clarity. They prevent panic from becoming a frequency collapse. Silence is another underestimated guardian. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence where you can hear the impulses of the future self emerging. In the void, noise amplifies confusion, stillness amplifies coherence. A few minutes of guided quiet can help you differentiate between the pull of old triggers and the pull of the new frequency. When your mind feels desperate to latch onto something familiar, that's your indicator, the old identity is trying to revive itself. When your body feels strangely curious, soft, or spacious, that's the signal of the new coherence attempting to form. And then there's the art of withholding premature decisions. The void is not the time to change careers, end relationships, or redesign your life out of urgency. Urgency is the voice of the dying self. It wants to recreate structure as quickly as possible, even if that structure is misaligned. The emerging identity, on the other hand, communicates through subtlety, gentle nudges, intuitive micro-impulses, quiet knowing. The role of the transition guardian, your conscious awareness, is to protect this fragile emergence by refusing to act from fear. Acting too soon is the spiritual equivalent of tearing open the chrysalis. If you can hold the void without collapsing, if you can breathe, pause, listen, and choose not to resurrect the old self, you'll begin to notice something extraordinary. The new frequency starts to organize itself. It begins as a hum, a shift in your preferences, a sudden clarity that arrives out of nowhere. And once that hum grows strong enough, you'll feel the unmistakable pull toward the next stage, the moment when identity stops dissolving and begins crystallizing into form. Rebirth doesn't happen with fireworks or revelations, it starts as a frequency shift so subtle that most people miss it entirely. Long before the new identity becomes behavior, it becomes resonance. You feel it as a quiet stability rising inside the chaos, a sense that something in you has clicked even though nothing externally has changed. This is the earliest stage of the rebirth protocol, the new coherence field taking shape. After the quantum soup of dissolution, your system begins reorganizing around a higher signal, your future self, already broadcasting from beyond the threshold. The new identity forms first as sensation, micro-intuitions, flashes of clarity, sudden disinterest in old patterns, unexpected attraction to new impulses. This is identity metamorphosis happening at the atomic level, quantum biology in action. Imaginal structures within you begin activating, just like the imaginal cells inside the chrysalis that carry the blueprint of the butterfly. You're not becoming the new version, you're aligning with the frequency that's already encoded in your field. This is why old triggers feel distant and why certain environments suddenly feel incompatible. The frequency incompatibility event is no longer a crisis, it's a directional signal. As the new coherence strengthens, you begin sensing the architecture of the emerging self. Not through logic, but through recognition. Certain thoughts feel more true. Certain behaviors feel strangely effortless. Certain desires feel undeniably yours, even if they don't match any story from your old life. This is the future self imprinting onto your present identity. These early impulses are precious, they're the scaffolding of your quantum leap. Treat them like newborn wings, delicate, instinctive, and not yet ready to carry full weight. This is where micro-rituals become essential. The rebirth protocol doesn't demand dramatic change, it requires small, intentional calibrations that reinforce the new frequency. Morning coherence practices, tiny identity commitments, embodied intention, even a simple question, what would the emerging version of me choose right now? These rituals don't create the identity, they stabilize the frequency. They help your nervous system map the new resonance so it doesn't default back into phantom life behaviors. Every micro-choice is a vote for the future self. And then, almost imperceptibly, something extraordinary happens, the new identity consolidates. A sense of internal orientation returns. The void stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a womb. You catch yourself acting, speaking, deciding from a place that feels undeniably new. And that moment, the moment you feel yourself inhabiting a frequency that once felt impossible, is the birth cry of the next version of you. From here, the final phase begins, bringing this new frequency into reality so the world can reorganize around who you've become. Integration is the moment your internal metamorphosis begins to touch the external world. After the quantum death, the void, and the chrysalis, the new identity emerges not as an idea but as a stable frequency, one that reality can finally respond to. You'll notice this shift before you can explain it. People treat you differently without knowing why. Synchronicities rearrange themselves around you. Old problems dissolve without effort, while new opportunities appear as if they were waiting for this exact version of you. This isn't magic, it's frequency coherence. Your field has changed, so your environment reorganizes to match. Returning to life with a new frequency feels like switching radio stations and realizing the music has been playing all along, you just weren't tuned to it before. The feelings of grief of old self fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that feels both ancient and brand new. You respond to challenges differently, not because you're trying, but because the identity that used to panic simply no longer exists. This is immunity to old triggers. The ghosts of dead lives stop calling your name. The phantom life loses all gravitational pull. Not through effort, but through irrelevance. Integration isn't about rebuilding your old life, it's about letting reality recognize your identity phase transition and respond accordingly. You might notice certain relationships stabilizing while others dissolve effortlessly. You may find yourself craving new environments, new routines, new rhythms of thought. This is your coherence field becoming selective, aligning with what matches your new signal and naturally releasing what doesn't. You're not letting go, you're resonating differently. And resonance always wins over willpower. As the new frequency stabilizes, your future self becomes your present self. The quantum leap you once sensed becomes embodied. You think differently, perceive differently, choose differently, not because you're forcing change, but because you've crossed the threshold where the old self can no longer function. Your life begins to demonstrate what the transformation has accomplished. Clarity replaces confusion, groundedness replaces floating, intuition replaces noise. And the world, subtly, unmistakably, meets you as the identity you've become, not the one you buried. This is the completion of the quantum death navigation protocol. Not an ending, but a beginning. The moment where you step into reality carrying the coherence of a new frequency, aware that every interaction, every decision, every breath is now anchored in a self that didn't exist before. And yet, even here, the metamorphosis continues, because integration isn't static. It's a living relationship with the new you, preparing you for the next quiet leap your consciousness is already dreaming of.